This is a Middle Loop class.
Hi, I'm Jerry with Middle and today we delve into the details of focusing the camera on your DJI drone. We often get questions on a variety of topics, and although focus seems to be fairly straightforward, it's been the source of frustrations for some. We'll start out with a brief introduction. Then we'll dive into autofocus, showing the various types and the different ways to trigger it. Next, manual focus and how it differs from drone to drone. Finally, some additional information. We'll show a workaround for drones that don't have the autofocus single mode. We explain depth of field and how to control it, some troubleshooting tips for those having problems, and a quick segment on a feature you might find useful to make sure your videos are in focus. Before we get started, a quick note on using a stylus. As you'll see, we'll be using features that require using the touchscreen, and whenever the touchscreen is involved, we always recommend using a stylus. Some of the on-screen buttons tend to be pretty small, and since your fingers won't be touching the screen, it'll stay much cleaner. We have a link to the stylus we use in the description. Now, let's get started. Most DJI drones have similar functionality when it comes to focus. They typically have two focus modes. There's autofocus and manual focus. To toggle back and forth, simply tap on the focus button. This button may look different depending on which drone you have and the mode it's in. On the DJI Fly app, you'll usually find the button here. It'll be labeled either AF or MF, depending on whether it's in automatic focus or manual focus mode. On the DJI Go 4 app, the button is usually at the top of the screen. Here too, the label changes depending on the current mode. It'll either be AF-MF or AFC-MF. Let's first talk about autofocus. As you'll see, there are a couple of autofocus types, but essentially, autofocus is where the drone decides on what the subject is and then adjusts the lens so that that subject is in focus. Now, there is a method that we'll show where you pick the subject and the drone automatically focuses on it. More on that later. The two autofocus types are continuous mode and single mode. Here, for example, on the Mavic 3 Cine, when in autofocus mode, it uses the continuous type, meaning it updates the focus continuously throughout the flight anytime the camera detects a change. Here, the object in the foreground is in focus. As the drone rotates, the camera updates its focus and then picks the mountains as the subject. Now, as we rotate it back, the camera once again updates, choosing the more centered object as the subject and focuses on it. The same goes for when the subject itself is moving closer to or further from the drone. The camera should continually update, keeping that object in focus. Now, this drone only has the one continuous type of autofocus. However, some drones have both continuous and single types. Here, for example, is the Mavic 2 Pro. In the DJI Go 4 app, under Camera Settings, and then General Camera Settings, there's a switch to toggle on and off AFC, which is autofocus continuous. When on, it operates as we showed above, continuously. When off, it's in autofocus single mode. In this mode, it still automatically focuses, but only when you trigger it. Some people prefer this mode under certain conditions, especially if you're having a common problem with the drone hunting for the proper focus. Just keep in mind that if your subject moves closer to or further from the drone, and you want to update the focus, you'll need to trigger it again. So how do you trigger it to autofocus? Well, there are a couple of options. Probably the most widely used is the focus shutter button. This is the button on the top right side of the controller. Pushing this button halfway down causes the drone's camera to focus. This works for both taking photos and shooting video. Another way to trigger the camera to autofocus is to tap on the screen. It's a little different than using the focus button like we just described. When tapping on the screen, not only does it trigger a focus update, but it also triggers an update to the exposure. That's assuming you have auto exposure turned on. An additional feature of using the screen tap is that you get to tell the camera what the subject is. Like in this example, as I tap the bottle, the focus changes to the bottle even though it's off-center. Incidentally, each of these methods of triggering it to focus works in both continuous and single modes. However, if you're using the screen tap to select the subject that's off-center, and you're in continuous mode, as you might expect, there's a good chance that the camera will almost immediately refocus back on what it thinks the subject is. We'll show a workaround for this a little later. To put the camera in manual focus mode, refer to the introduction earlier in this video. Manual focus is exactly what you'd expect. The camera will not focus automatically, even if you press the focus button or tap on the screen. To change the focus when in manual mode, you need to use the focus slider. Now, depending on which drone you're using, the slider may or may not automatically appear when you enter manual focus mode. Some drones, like this one, toggling to manual focus simply locks the focus right where it is. If your slider doesn't automatically pop up, just tap on and hold the focus button for a second and the slider should open. Then drag down to focus on distant objects and drag up to focus close in. Remember earlier when I recommended using a stylus? It's particularly useful here. Okay, when you have it where you want it, release it and the focus will stay right where it is. Also, some drones have this AF at the top and bottom of the slider. If yours does, you can move the slider all the way up or down to easily switch back to autofocus mode. If you remember, we mentioned that some drones don't have that single type of autofocus. A workaround to mimic that behavior is to use a combination of the autofocus and manual focus. Now, there are a couple ways to do this. Probably the easiest is to start with the drone in manual focus mode. Frame up your subject so it's centered, then toggle the focus button to automatic. The camera should automatically focus on your subject. When it does, immediately toggle the focus mode back to manual to lock it. Although not nearly as convenient as autofocus single mode, your subject should stay in focus as long as the distance between the drone and the subject don't change. Any photographer can tell you that depth of field is an important factor when it comes to focus. Now, we're not going to dive into the topic too deeply, but basically depth of field is how much of the field is in focus. In this example of a narrow or shallow depth of field, only the subject is in focus while the background and foreground are blurred. On the contrary, with a wide or deep depth of field, almost the entire field is in focus. Great for landscapes. There are a number of factors that control how shallow or deep the depth of field is. Distance to the subject is one factor. The closer you are, the depth of field is narrower. The lens is a factor. A telephoto lens, zoomed in, is narrower than a wide-angle lens. And then there's aperture. Now, not all drone cameras let you control aperture. For example, the Mavic 3 Pro has 3 cameras. 2 of the cameras have a fixed aperture, but the Hasselblad camera with the 4/3 sensor has an adjustable aperture from f2.8 to f11, which is great. The larger the number, the deeper the depth of field, meaning that more will be in focus. Just keep in mind that the aperture also affects exposure. The higher the number, less light gets in. So what if you're having difficulty getting your camera to focus? Here's a list of factors that might be causing your issue. I'll highlight a few. Perhaps you're shooting dark or distant objects. Or maybe your object is too close. Check your specs, but most DJI drones have a minimum distance of 1 meter. The minimum is even further as you zoom in. Shiny or reflective objects can also cause issues, as well as if your subject or aircraft are moving too fast. If everything seems correct and you're still having issues, check the lens for dirt or smudges. Remove the ND filter or the clear filter if it has one. It simply might need to be cleaned. There also could be a mechanical issue. To check this, put the drone in manual focus mode and move the slider up and down. If nothing seems to change, it could simply be broken and needs to be repaired. There is a feature on many DJI drones that you might find useful when it comes to focus. On some, it's called peaking level. Others, peaking threshold. When enabled, you get an on-screen indication that objects are in focus. Here, for example, the red highlights confirm that the fence and tree are in focus. Turning it on varies depending on the drone. Here on the Mavic 3, which uses the Fly app, tap on the 3 dots in the upper right. Then, under the Camera tab, scroll down until you find Peaking Level. Enable it by selecting Low, Normal, or High. The higher you go, the thicker the outline on objects that are in focus. Also note that this feature on the Mavic 3 only works when in manual focus mode. Now it's a little different on the Go 4 app. Here on the Mavic 2 Pro, under Camera Settings, then General Camera Settings, scroll down and you'll find Peaking Threshold. Here select High, Standard, or Low. And on this drone, it's the opposite. The lower the selection, the more pronounced the highlights. Also on this drone, the feature works in both manual and automatic settings. So that's it for this quick class. We have plenty more where this came from on our channel. Also, if you have an idea for a future video, please leave a comment and we'll see what we can do. Thank you, have a great day, and happy flying.